On this episode of the podcast, I have with me Cassio Goldschmidt, CISO at ServiceTitan. This is part 2 of our discussion. Cassio's been generous with his time, and we're going to dive into some of the shifting left that's happening. He has some interesting dynamics to his team, MBA, computer science backgrounds. Definitely want to talk to him about how he hires for that type of team. And also he mentioned on part 1 about security is an afterthought. So I want to talk to him about how is security becoming an active participant at ServiceTitan. Cassio, thanks for staying on and doing this.
Thanks. Glad to be back.
Awesome, man. Awesome. So last podcast episode on part 1, we were talking about your team. Kind of unique. So maybe let's go back and talk about that, because I think you mentioned that everyone on your team has an MBA and also backgrounds in computer science. That's a pretty darn good combination to have from anywhere. But I was just curious, talk to us a little bit about your team makeup and how integral that MBA is to you executing.
So the interesting thing is that was never something that I started a team thinking about having, this kind of background there. It just happened. When we were interviewing people, we were hiring, and suddenly we go and look at everyone's curriculum and go, wow, it's really neat that we were able to hire, people with this kind of background. It has been really helpful in order to talk to the business and talk to engineering at the same time and get the understanding from both in the cooperation of both sides in order to get things going. A lot of times you find vulnerabilities and you see reports in penetration tests, and vulnerabilities that are marked as high severity, for example, cross-site scripting. And then you look at the actual vulnerability, and when you try to understand what the risk is, it's pretty much okay. If a user is actually trying to do something in the system, he can actually inject a cross-site scripting that is going to reflect against himself. So yes, it is technically a vulnerability, but the impact of that vulnerability from a business perspective is okay, nobody's going to get hurt besides the person who actually created the attack, right? A lot of times I tell people that for a small business, risk is not about the vulnerabilities they have, but really to make payroll next month, right? And this understanding about how fast things should be fixed and how they should be fixed is very important. So otherwise, I've seen in a lot of companies, information security becomes the very stiff group, the dictators of this must be fixed no matter what at this date. And they end up losing the trust of teams such as engineering. And with that, the teams start to bypass security. So you better work with the people who are actually building the code and everything else, and try to make them a ally in your initiative to make things secure, right? And that's something that we try to do by bringing the engineering team to what we're doing, and at the same time, try to shield them from the security tools that we have. So, for example, in the last episode, I mentioned that we're changing a lot of the tools that we use, and some of those tools became less effective over time because programming languages were changing and the way you build web pages were changing. Well, because those tools became less effective and they were more false positives, we decided to curate all the findings and only let engineering know about the findings that were actually relevant once they were triaged by the information security team. These days, we're trying to change things again and go to a shift left type of approach. So with that, the first thing that we do is let's involve engineering, because now if they're going to run this tool integrated with their IDE while they are programming and trying to find vulnerabilities right there, they must really like the tool. Otherwise, everyone's going to disable it, and we're going to be worse than we were before, right? So it's really important to have this partnership because it really became everyone's job to secure the company, right? And I mentioned a lot of times engineering, but this is true with HR, it's true with infrastructure, and sales, everyone else in the company. They need to understand that security is no longer the police, but really a business enabler, right? Somebody who is there to help to get to larger accounts, to help people to understand that, our customers understand that we're doing the right thing from a security perspective. And that will be good for all of us at the end of the day.
It's interesting because, I think security, as you mentioned, traditionally afterthought, typically not the most active participant, right, in the process because it tended to come after everybody had already done their work. As you're seeing the shift left, as more of an active participant, are you seeing the view of other engineering teams change in how they're kind of viewing security now? Is it kind of, is it shedding some light? Is it kind of demystifying that, they're not the hard asses, they're actually here to partner with me?
Yeah, and I think a lot of that goes to education, right? Really make people understand what is security in the first place. Because a lot of people don't understand the difference between security features and secure features, right? And there's a big difference there. One is to make things and use defensive code and defensive techniques in order to avoid code from being abused. Why a lot of people, when they talk about security, they think about encryption, right? Everyone thinks about encryption when you talk about security, and lately about passwords and this kind of things, but never thinking about, okay, I'm exposing this service on the internet. What could possibly go wrong? How this thing could be abused in such a way that would become a problem for us or for our clients, or disclose information that we don't want to be disclosed, right? Or simply be attacked in such a way that would bring the entire offering that we have down. So I think that goes a long way to educate people to understand what's the difference between, secure features. And then I think at the tail end, you have things like threat modeling, right? When people really understand how attacks work and try to start thinking like an attacker. And when you get your team at that level, a lot of the job of the security team is actually becomes decentralized. You have other people to start doing the day-to-day job, and you start really looking at governance, what's the threat landscape, and bringing the latest news to the company. And that's what we're trying to accomplish.
So I guess from your perspective, when you mentioned just go back to building your team because I'm curious, as you have new people come on, obviously you have different capabilities on the team. Does that change your view of hiring? Or does it maybe set a new bar for hiring? Or how does your current team maybe affect the way you hire future people?
The bar to get hired is pretty high, and the way we do is the candidate is interviewed by everybody, and if there's any reason because people doesn't like the candidate for whatever reason, if it is not unanimous, I'd rather pass the candidate because it's pretty expensive to hire the wrong people. At the same time, I always like to understand where people are coming from. I always ask, hey, what's your history? I mean, tell me a little bit how you got into security, how you got into software engineering and so on. And I think that's sometimes one of the most important questions to ask because it will show the level of passion that somebody has, the level of commitment, how the person keep himself or herself current, because things are changing all the time, especially in security, right? And if you're just you took a few courses out there and then thought that this was going to be enough to keep you going, it's simply not, right? So I tend to listen really careful when I'm asking people about their previous experience, their hobbies, how they got in, understand the ethics of how they got into security. A lot of times in the past you see people loving the guys or girls who were into hacking. Sometimes it's better to hire people who actually came from a really clean background and was always in the defensive side.
Hmm, interesting. And I guess when you're kind of looking at that overall team and we were talking about in part one how, things are changing, the roadmap's changing, different needs going into, potential ML AI solutions. Are you starting to see a shift in how you think you might, tactically change your team or hire for your team in the future because of the shift of everything you're saying?
Yeah, so AI and ML, although overhyped, there are a lot of things that can be done and can save people from doing repetitive work or even, do things different than they did in the past. So, for example, phishing attacks, you can see a lot of benefits coming from just looking at the message that you're receiving and seeing the patterns and so on that in the past were not there. Vulnerability management, there are incredible tools out there right now to help you not only find the vulnerabilities, but really classify them, understand the entire attack, understand how people would get into your company and so on. And it affects all areas, even compliance. For example, in the past, when you have a audit such as a SOC 2 audit or PCI, you would need somebody to go to different teams and get all the evidence and screenshots and so on. If you're running a pure cloud environment for your SaaS offering, there's a lot that you can do with the APIs. And a lot of this work that needs to happen every year can be automated. And with a press of a button, you may get most of your evidence there, and then just have to do the walkthroughs and tell your auditors about the process, and have a much better visibility on what's going on at your company.
I think what you've been talking about is an interesting, I guess, evolution and the ability to be a little bit more agile than maybe security was 10, 5, 20, whatever years ago. Because it sounds like just even the pandemic, the changing model of what you have to deal with is requiring you to, not only be aware of third party solutions, building internal solutions, but also from the business component, being aware of that. It sounds like the whole package has gotten a lot more complicated maybe than it was even just a few years ago.
Yes, absolutely. And, with that comes the difference in skill sets and everything else, right? I think as the CISO, these days, it's not only about technical aspects of the job anymore. There's also the business aspects, but also the legal aspect, right? We have a bunch of new laws coming up with regards to privacy and so on. And you have to understand those things. You have to move one level up from what you were in the past, and likewise, everyone is stepping a level up in order to keep up with what's going on. The network engineer had to learn about, infrastructure as code, and it just goes on and on.
Absolutely. I mean, it sounds like there's no ending amount of work to keep you busy. And I guess when you're looking at that, right, just out of curiosity, I always like to ask security professionals, about the mental health aspect. And from your perspective, there's a lot to do. Do you see the mental health side in security different from other areas? Just because, this asymmetric battle means you just have to get one thing wrong with other teams. I don't have to deploy my code necessarily today. I can wait if I found something wrong with you. It's never a resting period.
Yeah, and it's something that takes away a lot of sleep of a lot of people. You have to really look at the problem and try to identify, okay, what is the root cause that is actually creating all this stress, or where the opportunities are, right? So a lot of times the risk assessment that was done before, that would just come with a laundry list of things that are either red, yellow, or green, needs to change from that, and try to understand what are the odds of a attack happening and what's the cost of actually trying to fix that. And there are a lot of frameworks that came over the last few years that unfortunately haven't been fully adopted by the industry, that can help quite a bit. For example, there was a book called How to Measure Everything in Software Security that came out a few years ago, that tells you how to run like Monte Carlo simulations in order to try to understand what's the most likely scenario for an attack, and how much you should invest in order to prevent that. There's the FAIR framework, which was mapped to NIST CSF. And those are some things that the industry need to catch up in order to really understand the risk they're dealing with, and make sure that they're targeting the right things one at a time, unfortunately, but that's the way you do, right? And go from there.
It sounds like juggling these different pieces, especially the last 6 to 8 months, has probably been super challenging. And I definitely appreciate you coming on the podcast and kind of talking through part one, part two. And if you didn't listen to part one of the podcast, go back one and hopefully listen to it, because I think it was really interesting, and talking about some of the foundations of what Cassio is doing, Shadow IT. But I really appreciate you being on and sharing your thoughts with us.
Thanks so much. My pleasure.
Absolutely. That's it for this episode. Can't thank Cassio enough for his time. We'll be back again, hopefully tomorrow, with another show. As always, please give me some feedback. I'm always trying to improve the show, trying to get better value out to everyone. Subscribe. If this is the first time you're listening, please subscribe. That's the best way we can grow the show's footprint. It has been growing pretty quickly, and I'm just super excited to see what we can do. Until next time, thanks.